Tom and Sarah were siblings who had grown up in the small, sleepy town of Willow Creek, nestled deep in the heart of the Midwest. Their childhood home, a modest two-story house surrounded by sprawling fields and towering oak trees, was a sanctuary that held countless memories of laughter, shared secrets, and mutual support. After their parents died in a tragic car accident, when Tom was 18 and Sarah was 15, the siblings became each other's entire world. Tom, being the older of the two by 3 years, naturally took on the role of protector. He worked part-time jobs to help make ends meet while Sarah focused on her studies. Despite the hardships, their bond was unbreakable. They spent weekends exploring the nearby woods, helping neighbors, and dreaming about the future. Tom provided Sarah with comfort and stability when the world around them seemed to crumble, becoming her rock and her guiding star. As the years passed, their closeness deepened. They shared not only their joys but also their fears and aspirations. Tom was proud of Sarah's intelligence and kindness, while Sarah admired Tom's strength and unwavering dedication. Their relationship was the envy of many in Willow Creek, a testament to the resilience of familial love in the face of adversity. However, as they transitioned from adolescence to adulthood, subtle shifts began to alter the dynamics of their relationship. Tom started feeling a confusing and intense affection towards Sarah that went beyond sibling love. At first, he dismissed these feelings as a natural evolution of their deep bond. But as time went on, they grew harder to ignore. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when his feelings changed, but the once clear boundaries between brother and sister began to blur in his mind. Tom struggled with his emotions, knowing that his feelings were inappropriate and would forever alter their relationship if revealed. He became increasingly withdrawn, spending more time alone, lost in his thoughts. Sarah, unaware of her brother's internal turmoil, continued to grow into a beautiful and confident woman. She was actively involved in community projects, excelled in her studies, and had become a beacon of hope and positivity in their town. As Sarah entered college, Tom's sense of responsibility and protectiveness intensified. He feared losing her to the vastness of the world beyond Willow Creek, clinging to the last remnants of their childhood. The transition was difficult for both, as Tom struggled to balance his protective instincts with Sarah's desire for independence. Sarah's time at college introduced her to new experiences, new people, and new perspectives. She made friends from diverse backgrounds, engaged in various extracurricular activities, and began to see the world through a broader lens. It was during this period of growth that Sarah met David, a charismatic and outgoing young man who swept her off her feet. David's vibrant personality and genuine affection for Sarah were everything Tom was not. Spontaneous, carefree, and unburdened by the heavy responsibilities that weighed Tom down. David's entrance into Sarah's life brought about a whirlwind romance. They spent weekends exploring the city, traveling together, and building a future filled with love and happiness. Sarah felt a sense of completeness she had never known before, experiencing what it was like to be truly in love. The joy and excitement she shared with David highlighted the emptiness that had been growing within Tom. As Sarah's relationship with David blossomed, Tom's feelings of jealousy and possessiveness began to fester. He watched from the sidelines as his sister grew closer to another man, the very idea of which tore at his soul. The innocence of their childhood bond was now overshadowed by a complex web of emotions that Tom struggled to navigate. He found himself questioning his own worth and grappling with the fear that he could never provide Sarah with the happiness she deserved. Sarah and David's relationship progressed rapidly, much to Tom's dismay. Their whirlwind romance led to frequent declarations of love, spontaneous trips, and a shared vision of the future that seemed too perfect to be true. Within a year, David proposed to Sarah in a picturesque park under the canopy of blooming cherry blossoms. The engagement was met with joy and excitement, especially from Sarah, who saw it as the culmination of their shared dreams. When Sarah called Tom to share the happy news, he forced himself to sound enthusiastic, masking the turmoil that churned within him. His heart felt heavy at the thought of another man claiming Sarah's heart, and the idea of her being intimate with someone else drove him to the brink of madness. Despite his internal struggle, Tom congratulated his sister, concealing the depths of his anguish. The day of the wedding arrived, and Willow Creek buzzed with anticipation. The ceremony was held in the town's charming chapel, adorned with delicate white flowers and lit by the soft glow of afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. Tom stood by his sister's side as the best man, a role he had accepted with a heavy heart. He had perfected the art of masking his true feelings, presenting a facade of joy and support to everyone around him. As he watched Sarah walk down the aisle in her flowing white dress, looking like an angel, Tom felt a wave of possessiveness surge through him. The vows she exchanged with David felt like a betrayal, a final nail in the coffin of the life he had once imagined with her. He recalled their childhood dreams of growing old together, of sharing a life filled with love and mutual understanding. Now, those dreams were being shattered by the reality of Sarah's new life with David. After the ceremony, the reception was a grand affair, filled with laughter, dancing, and heartfelt toasts. Friends and family gathered to celebrate the union of the happy couple. But Tom watched from the corner of the room, his eyes never leaving Sarah. She was radiant, her smile lighting up the room, and it was killing him inside. When she danced with David, laughing and smiling, Tom felt a darkness settle over him, a cold, creeping sensation that something within him had snapped. As the evening wore on, Tom struggled to maintain his composure. He tried to engage in conversations and join in the festivities, but his mind was consumed by thoughts of Sarah and David. The joyous atmosphere around him only intensified his feelings of isolation and despair. By the end of the night, Tom had retreated to his old room in the house, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. In the months that followed the wedding, Tom's mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. The initial shock of Sarah's marriage gave way to a deepening obsession that consumed his every waking moment. He became increasingly isolated, distancing himself from friends and even neglecting his responsibilities. His thoughts were relentlessly consumed by Sarah and David, and he found himself unable to escape the constant barrage of emotions that plagued him. Tom started to resent David, blaming him for taking Sarah away. He watched from the sidelines as the couple built their life together, every sight of them exacerbating his feelings of jealousy and inadequacy. The vibrant and lively David was everything Tom was not: outgoing, charismatic, and full of life. This contrast only deepened Tom's sense of inadequacy and fueled his growing animosity. As Tom's obsession grew, he began to stalk the couple, watching their every move, learning their routines, and mapping out their lives with meticulous detail. He followed them on their travels, surveilled their interactions, and even hacked into their social media accounts to gather more information. His once orderly life had become a twisted maze of jealousy, anger, and unrequited love. Sarah, unaware of her brother's inner turmoil, noticed that Tom had become more distant. She attributed his behavior to the pressures of adulthood and assumed he was busy with work or personal matters. Sarah tried to reach out, inviting him to family gatherings and encouraging him to share his burdens. But Tom always declined, preferring to remain in the shadows. One night, unable to sleep, Tom lay in bed replaying memories of Sarah over and over in his mind. He envisioned her smile, her infectious laugh, the way she used to hug him when they were younger. Each memory was a dagger to his heart, a painful reminder of what he had lost and could never regain. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of David with Sarah would intrude, fueling the hatred he harbored for the man. The guilt of his feelings weighed heavily on him, but the emotions were too powerful to ignore. Tom knew he couldn't continue living in a world where Sarah belonged to someone else. The pain and frustration had built up to a breaking point, leaving him with a singular, destructive thought. He had to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. This dangerous line of thinking set him on a path from which there was no return. In the darkest corners of his mind, Tom began to formulate a plan. He convinced himself that what he was about to do was for the best, that it would free Sarah from the grip of a man who didn't deserve her. His love for her, once pure and protective, had twisted into an obsession that clouded his judgment. In his warped reality, he believed that Sarah would come to understand and even accept what he was about to do, viewing it as an act of liberation rather than violence. The first step in his plan was to acquire a weapon. Tom had never been violent before, but the intensity of his emotions overrode any sense of rationality. He researched the types of firearms that would be easy to conceal and quick to use. Eventually, he settled on a handgun, something that felt both cold and heavy in his hands, symbolizing the dark path he was about to embark on. Tom began frequenting the local gun store under various pretexts, learning about different models and practicing discreetly. He bought a gun in cash, avoiding any traceable methods that could link him to the purchase. Each visit to the store deepened his commitment to his plan, as he rationalized his actions and pushed aside any lingering doubts. Once he had the weapon, Tom turned his focus to understanding Sarah and David's routines. He followed them, noting the times they left for work, their social engagements, and their habits at home. He observed how they interacted, identifying moments when they were alone or vulnerable. This meticulous planning gave him a false sense of control, making him believe that he was capable of executing his plan without fail. Tom also began to prepare himself mentally and emotionally. He isolated himself further, cutting off any remaining ties to friends and family who might notice his descent into madness. He spent hours alone, reinforcing his belief that his actions were justified and that he was acting out of love. He told himself that this was the only way to ensure that Sarah would be happy, free from what he perceived as the constraints of her relationship with David. Despite the careful planning, Tom struggled with moments of hesitation. He would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, questioning his sanity and the morality of his impending actions. These moments of doubt were fleeting, however, as the overwhelming need to possess Sarah and eliminate David overshadowed any lingering sense of right and wrong. On a cold, rainy night in late October, Tom decided it was time to put his plan into motion. The weather mirrored his turbulent emotions, with dark clouds casting shadows over the town and the steady rain masking any sounds that might give away his presence. He drove to Sarah and David's house, his hands steady on the wheel as he navigated the dark, wet streets. When he arrived, he parked a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. The rain soaked through his clothes, but he didn't feel the cold. His mind was focused solely on the task ahead, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses and dulling his fears. He approached the house cautiously, glancing around to ensure he wasn't being watched. Tom had memorized the layout of the house during his observations, knowing exactly where Sarah and David would be at this hour. He picked the lock on the back door with surprising ease, slipping inside silently. The familiar scent of home, mixed with the fresh smell of rain, momentarily grounded him, but he pushed the feeling aside, reminding himself of the purpose of his intrusion. The sound of the TV in the living room masked his footsteps as he crept through the house, each step calculated and deliberate. He approached Sarah's room first, pausing briefly before entering. She was asleep, her face peaceful and serene, oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows. For a moment, Tom felt a pang of sorrow, a flicker of the brother he once was, but it was quickly replaced by his obsessive determination. Moving towards the living room, Tom found David sitting on the couch, engrossed in the movie they were watching. The sight of David, who had become the center of Sarah's world, ignited a surge of anger within him. He watched as David laughed at the screen, completely unaware of the storm brewing just feet away. Tom knew he had only one chance to execute his plan swiftly. Any delay could mean missing the perfect moment, or worse, being discovered. He raised the gun, his hand trembling slightly as he steadied his aim. The weight of the weapon in his hand felt both empowering and terrifying, a tangible representation of the irreversible decision he was about to make. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he took aim at David. Every memory of Sarah, every shared moment, fueled his determination to proceed. He saw her face, heard her laughter, and felt the warmth of her presence as he steadied his hand. The room was filled with the sounds of the movie, but for Tom, it felt like an eternity in the span of a few seconds. "David," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. David looked up, startled by the unexpected presence of his brother-in-law. His confusion quickly turned to fear as he recognized the gun in Tom's hand. "Tom, what are you doing?" he stammered, taking a cautious step back. Before David could react, Tom pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the room, silencing the movie and freezing the moment in time. David slumped forward, blood pooling around him as he collapsed onto the couch. Sarah, awakened by the noise, turned to see Tom standing over her husband, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "Tom, what are you doing?" Sarah cried, backing away from the gun as her heart raced. She reached out, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and confusion. Tom hesitated, the reality of his actions momentarily crashing over him. He looked into Sarah's eyes, seeing the terror and disbelief reflected back at him. But the resolve he had built over months of obsession overpowered any remaining shred of his former self. He took a deep breath, the weight of the gun in his hand anchoring him to his decision. Without warning, Tom turned the gun towards Sarah. Her eyes widened in horror as he pulled the trigger once more. The second gunshot echoed through the room, and Sarah collapsed beside her husband, her body lifeless. In that instant, the storm that had raged within Tom finally found its outlet, leaving behind a scene of tragic devastation. Tom stood there for a moment, heartbroken and bewildered, as the weight of what he had done washed over him. The once unbreakable bond between brother and sister had been shattered by a torrent of uncontrollable emotions, leaving nothing but sorrow and destruction in its wake. The aftermath of that fateful night was a blur of police sirens, flashing lights, and the overwhelming presence of grief. Neighbors who had known the siblings since childhood gathered outside the house, their faces etched with concern and disbelief. The small community of Willow Creek was thrust into a state of shock, struggling to comprehend the tragedy that had unfolded within their midst. Detectives arrived at the scene, quickly assessing the situation. The evidence was clear. Both Sarah and David had been killed in a murder-suicide, with Tom being the apparent perpetrator. However, something about the scene didn't sit right with the lead detective, a seasoned investigator named Laura Martinez, who had a knack for seeing beyond the obvious. As the investigation progressed, Martinez delved deeper into the lives of the victims. She interviewed friends, family members, and acquaintances, piecing together the complex relationships and emotional undercurrents that led to the tragic events. It became evident that Tom had harbored deep-seated feelings for Sarah, feelings that had transformed into an unhealthy obsession over time. Meanwhile, Sarah's close friends grappled with the loss, each coping in their own way. Some sought solace in each other, while others struggled to make sense of the senseless violence that had taken away two beloved members of their community. The town mourned, collectively feeling the weight of the loss and the questions that lingered in the air. For Tom, the end of his life was the culmination of years of inner turmoil and unresolved emotions. In his final moments, he experienced a fleeting sense of relief, believing that he had freed Sarah from what he perceived as the confines of her relationship with David. However, the reality of his actions was far more complex and tragic than he could ever have imagined. As news of the murders spread, the town of Willow Creek was abuzz with rumors and speculations. The legal system moved swiftly, with charges being filed and the case quickly moving to court. The trial was a media sensation, drawing attention from neighboring towns and even reaching national headlines due to the shocking nature of the crimes. Detective Martinez led the prosecution, presenting a compelling case that highlighted Tom's obsession and the premeditated nature of the murders. Evidence of his stalking behavior, the meticulous planning, and his confession painted a clear picture of his intent and mental state. Witnesses testified about Tom's increasing isolation and erratic behavior in the months leading up to the crime, providing a timeline of his descent into madness. The defense, however, attempted to portray Tom as a troubled individual suffering from severe mental health issues. They brought in psychiatrists to argue that his actions were the result of a psychotic break, a desperate plea for help rather than a calculated act of violence. They aimed to mitigate his responsibility by highlighting his fragile mental state and the lack of direct intent to cause harm. The courtroom was filled with tension as the jury deliberated, weighing the evidence and testimonies presented by both sides. The community watched closely, torn between feelings of sympathy for the siblings and horror at the reality of the crime. In the end, the jury found Tom guilty of second-degree murder for both Sarah and David, citing his clear intent and premeditation. The judge, recognizing the gravity of the crime and the impact on the community, sentenced Tom to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow, as the town grappled with the loss of two of its own and the betrayal of a once-beloved family member. Tom's life behind bars was a stark contrast to the world he had once known. Separated from the familiar sights and sounds of Willow Creek, he was thrust into the harsh reality of prison life. The institution was a cold, unwelcoming environment, filled with strict routines and guarded by men who had their own dark pasts. The walls were lined with barbed wire, and the air was thick with tension and uncertainty. Isolation became Tom's new reality. The loss of freedom, coupled with the constant reminders of his actions, weighed heavily on him. He spent his days in his cell, reflecting on his life and the choices that led him to this point. The once strong and protective brother was now a broken man, haunted by the memories of what he had done. In prison, Tom found it difficult to connect with others. The inmates, hardened by their own experiences, viewed him with suspicion and indifference. Conversations were limited, and trust was a rare commodity. Tom became a ghost among the living, drifting through each day with a sense of numbness and despair. The monotony of prison life provided little distraction from his guilt. He rarely left his cell, preferring the solitude to the chaos of the outside world. When he did venture out, it was to attend court hearings or participate in the limited programs available to inmates. Each visit from his attorney served as a reminder of the life he had lost and the future that would never be his. Tom's nights were the most difficult, as the darkness brought with it a flood of memories and regrets. He would lie awake, reliving the moments leading up to the murders, questioning every decision and wondering if there was any way to undo the irreversible damage he had caused. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it impossible to find peace or solace. Years passed in the unforgiving environment of prison, each day blending into the next with little variation. Tom's health began to decline, both physically and mentally, as the stress and trauma of his actions took a toll on his body and mind. The relentless cycle of guilt and regret consumed him, leaving him feeling empty and broken. In an attempt to find some semblance of peace, Tom sought out counseling and therapy programs offered within the prison. These sessions forced him to confront the depths of his obsession and the pain he had inflicted on himself and others. He began to understand the true extent of his mental deterioration, recognizing that his actions were the result of untreated emotional trauma and unresolved grief. Through therapy, Tom started to explore the possibility of redemption, hoping to make amends for his sins in any way he could. He engaged in writing and art programs, channeling his emotions into creative outlets that allowed him to process his pain. While the prison walls remained a constant reminder of his past, these activities provided a glimmer of hope for personal healing. Tom also formed tentative connections with other inmates, sharing his story and listening to theirs. These interactions, though limited, offered him a sense of community and understanding that he had longed for but never experienced outside. He began to see that he was not alone in his struggles, and that others had found ways to cope with their own demons. Despite his efforts, the weight of his actions never fully lifted. The faces of Sarah and David haunted his dreams, and the memories of that tragic night lingered in every corner of his mind. The path to redemption was long and fraught with challenges, but Tom clung to the hope that someday he might find a way to forgive himself. As the years dragged on, Tom's health continued to decline. The isolation and stress of prison life exacerbated his physical ailments, leaving him frail and weakened. He spent most of his time in his cell, the walls closing in around him as he grappled with the enormity of his actions and the life he had destroyed. One particularly cold winter night, Tom found himself unable to sleep. The biting cold seeped through the thin walls of his cell, and he wrapped himself in the only blanket he had, a tattered, worn piece that offered little warmth. As he lay there, shivering and restless, his mind wandered back to the days before the tragedy, to the bond he once shared with Sarah. In a rare moment of clarity, Tom realized that his obsession had blinded him to the true meaning of love and family. He had allowed his love for Sarah to twist into something dark and destructive, leading him down a path of violence and despair. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave, leaving him reeling and emotionally shattered. Determined to make sense of his pain, Tom began to write letters he would never send, to Sarah and David, expressing his remorse and sorrow. He poured his heart onto the pages, attempting to articulate the complex emotions that had driven him to commit the unthinkable act. These letters became a form of catharsis, a way for him to confront the demons that haunted him. Tom's health continued to deteriorate, and the reality of his mortality settled heavily upon him. The once strong and resilient man was now a shadow of his former self, his body frail and his spirit broken. The thought of dying behind bars, alone and forgotten, weighed on him, but he found a strange sense of acceptance in the inevitability of his fate. In his final days, Tom focused on finding peace within himself. He continued to attend therapy sessions, seeking forgiveness and understanding for his actions. The process was painful and fraught with setbacks, but he remained committed to the arduous journey of self-forgiveness. Tom also began to reach out to other inmates, sharing his story in the hopes of helping others who were struggling with their own inner demons. He spoke openly about his obsession, the pain of losing his family, and the devastating consequences of his actions. His honesty and vulnerability resonated with some of his fellow prisoners, creating a sense of connection and empathy that had long eluded him. As the end approached, Tom found solace in the small acts of kindness and understanding he received from others. He realized that, despite the darkness that had consumed him, there were moments of light and compassion that had helped him navigate the depths of his despair. These moments provided a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the bleakest of circumstances, there was potential for redemption and healing. On a quiet night in late spring, Tom lay in his cell, feeling the weight of his impending death settle over him. The room was silent, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of activity within the prison walls. He gazed out of the small window, the moon casting a soft glow on the barren landscape beyond. In his final moments, Tom reflected on his life, the love he had shared with Sarah, the bond that had been both his greatest strength and his most profound weakness. He thought about the years of grief and loss, the overwhelming emotions that had driven him to madness, and the irreversible actions that had changed the course of his life forever. As sleep began to overtake him, Tom felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had come to accept his fate, recognizing that he could no longer escape the consequences of his actions. The pain and guilt that had tormented him for so long were finally giving way to a fleeting sense of peace. In the depths of his consciousness, Tom saw Sarah's face, not as the woman he had hurt, but as the sister he had loved with all his heart. Her smile was gentle, her eyes filled with compassion and understanding. In that moment, Tom found the forgiveness he had been seeking, a release from the torment that had haunted him for years. Tom died quietly in his sleep that night, alone in his cell. His passing went largely unnoticed, just another life lost within the confines of the prison. There was no one to mourn him, no one to remember the man he had once been. His story, like so many others, faded into obscurity, a tragic tale of love, obsession, and the devastating consequences of a heart gone wrong. In the years that followed, the town of Willow Creek slowly began to move on from the tragedy that had shaken its foundations. Sarah and David were remembered as victims, their loss a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the depths of human emotion. The community came together to support one another, finding strength in their shared grief and resilience in the face of sorrow. Tom's story became a cautionary tale, whispered among the townspeople as a warning of the dangers of unchecked emotions and the importance of seeking help in times of need. It served as a reminder that even in the most seemingly ordinary lives, darkness can lurk beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As the years passed, the memories of the tragedy slowly faded, replaced by new stories and new beginnings. Willow Creek continued to thrive, its spirit unbroken by the shadows of the past. The siblings' story became just another dark chapter in the town's history, a reminder of the complex and often tumultuous nature of the human heart. In the end, Tom had paid the ultimate price for his sins, and as his life came to an end, so too did the torment that had haunted him for so many years. The town moved on, the memories of the tragedy slowly fading with time, and Tom's story became just another dark chapter in a book that was better left closed.